Good evening and welcome everyone to Tech Talks, the virtual series designed to provide technical assistance to residents interested in learning more about Glynn County Superfund sites. I'm your host, Rachel Thompson. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All microphones will stay muted until the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. In the meantime, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat and we'll go through each one during the Q&A session. Tech Talks are brought to you by the Glynn Environmental Coalition, a nonprofit organization founded in the 1990s by concerned citizens wanting to know how our community became so polluted, why we continue to have high levels of health-threatening pollution, and how an action plan could be developed to correct the problem. The fact that you're listening in today means that you share the concern and interest of our founding members, and we are extremely grateful for your participation. In our earlier episodes, we discussed what a Superfund site is, how the law that governs Superfund sites came into existence, and the key steps in the Superfund decision-making process. If you haven't seen them, please visit glynenvironmental.org/superfund to listen and learn. Our website will direct you to our YouTube channel that has all our current Tech Talks episodes. Thank you again for joining us for episode 3 in our virtual series. Today we'll be talking about the LCP Chemical Superfund Site. And more specifically, we'll be talking about Mercury at the cell buildings area and site-wide groundwater, also known as Operable Unit 2. A quick reminder, during the cleanup process, a site can be divided into a number of distinct areas. These areas, called operable units, also sometimes shortened to OU, may address geographic areas of a site, specific site problems, or areas where specific action is required. You can find definitions for keywords like this and others by visiting the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund Glossary. The website is shown right here on the screen. In today's episode, as we mentioned, we're going to discuss Operable Unit 2, or the Mercury at the cell buildings area and site-wide groundwater. To help us accomplish that, we have a special guest, Frank Anastasi, who is the Glynn Environmental Coalition's technical advisor. The Glynn Environmental Coalition has Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, technical assistance grants to help facilitate community involvement at the Superfund sites in Brunswick, Georgia. Those grants allow us to pay an independent third-party technical advisor that helps our community understand what's happening at our sites and the different steps that are going on in the process. I'm going to go ahead and hand over the virtual microphone to Frank, and so that he can help us get started.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here tonight. And let me just add that another part of the technical advisor's role in this situation is to help the community play a more meaningful role in the Superfund decision-making process. So I hope I'm helping to advance that goal, because we feel that if you're more informed, you can better participate. So let's talk about the background of the site. The LCP Chemical Superfund Site is located between the Turtle River and New Jessup Highway, just northwest of the Brunswick city limits. The potential responsible parties who have been paying for this cleanup for this site are Honeywell and Georgia Power. It's an 813-acre site, and the history of industrial activity spans from the 1920s through 1994. This includes oil refining, coal-fired power generation, and chemical and paint manufacturing. A little more on the site history. These past industrial activities contaminated soil, groundwater, adjacent surface waters and creeks, and the marshlands with polychlorinated biphenyl compounds. They're commonly referred to as PCBs, mercury, lead, dioxins, and another class of chemicals called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And we abbreviate that by calling them PAHs. So the plant closed in 1994 and it was demolished. About 130,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil and industrial wastes were removed from the uplands areas of the site by 1998. After that, the extent of contamination in the marsh sediments, contamination in the residual upland soils, and contamination in site-wide groundwater was defined. In 2020, EPA issued a record of decision for the uplands portion of the site, and they found that no further action was required for the upland soils as long as the site is not used for residential purposes in the future. A soil cover was placed over the former cell buildings area, which we're going to refer to as CBA, cell buildings area, where caustic chemicals were produced. And this was to prevent potential exposure to mercury, which can vaporize and come through the soil and go up into the air, and other contaminants that are in the subsurface there. Recently, cleanup of highly contaminated sediments in the creeks and the marsh was just completed. That was really completed and wrapped up in March 2024. The most contaminated sediments were dredged out and hauled off and disposed off-site in permitted facilities. Less contaminated areas were covered with sand, and all the disturbed areas are being restored with native plants. EPA expects to publish a proposed plan for the additional cleanup of the cell building area, or CBA, in June of 2024. And that's the main subject of this presentation, cleanup of the soil at the cell buildings area. But you can get full details about all of the cleanup actions at this site at the GEC website. So now we're talking about the next cleanup action, the one right on the cusp, cleaning up mercury at the cell buildings area, and also site-wide groundwater. So from 1944 to 1994, the mercury cell process was used to make sodium hydroxide, also known as caustic, hypochlorite, which is also commonly known as bleach, hydrochloric acid, chlorine gas, and hydrogen gas. They did this by immersing graphite and mercury in salty solutions at the cell buildings areas. Mercury, which is liquid under ambient conditions, was lost to the environment during these operations. Caustic solutions containing the dissolved mercury, as well as liquid sodium hydroxide, sodium chloride brine, and bleach spilled and leaked onto the ground all throughout this 50-year process. The above ground facilities are shown here during the demolition work, and also a little schematic diagram showing the activity, the manufacturing process facilities. They were demolished in the 90s. Mercury was removed from the process equipment and from spaces beneath and between the building slabs. And then the soil cover was placed over the footprint of the buildings. The residual mercury and other heavy metals concentrated in the subsurface under the cell buildings areas represent a continuing source of groundwater contamination. That's the problem. We've still got mercury in the ground. It's still causing groundwater contamination. So the first step in the cleanup action will be to reduce the amount of mercury in the soil that's available to continue to contaminate the groundwater. EPA will determine appropriate actions for all contaminants in site-wide groundwater at a later date. They're biting off a piece at a time on this. Let's deal with the mercury in the soil first. So now, where are we in the Superfund process today, May 2024? Well, the remedial investigation was completed and a report was released in September of 2022. And the goal of the remedial investigation is to we want to define the environmental problem that needs to be fixed. That's the first step in fixing the problem. What do you have to deal with? So the remedial investigation was conducted, and site-wide groundwater was studied, and the soil under the buildings was also studied. So as far as groundwater is concerned, what happened was this caustic pool of water in the ground formed under the cell buildings area. It had an extremely high pH, as high as 14, which is the far limit, basic limit of the scale. And it also contained large amounts of salts and dissolved solids. This contaminated blob, think of it, a heavy blob, sunk through the sands of the Sotillo Formation, and it went as deep as 50 feet. And the pool then spread out and settled on top of a 10-foot thick cemented sandstone layer that lies underneath that 50 feet of sand. Some contamination then migrated actually through the cemented sandstone and found its way into the underlying water-bearing sand known as the Upper Ebenezer Formation. So this slide shows what I just explained. You have layers of sediment, cemented sandstone, the Ebenezer Formation underneath, and the orange shows contaminated groundwater that's forming and flowing to the west of the site. It flows west and discharges into the creeks and ultimately heads towards the Turtle River. From 2013 to 2019, carbon dioxide was injected into the shallow groundwater in this area to lower the pH and remove dissolved contaminants. As a result of the carbon dioxide injection, mercury and other dissolved metals precipitated out of the groundwater. So you had these things dissolved in groundwater, and then when pH changed, they precipitated out as solids and that were deposited in the sands. Across the rest of the site, dissolved metals like mercury, arsenic, beryllium, chromium, lead, selenium, and vanadium are present at elevated levels at various depths and locations. This is across the entire site, not just the CBA area. Also present are chlorinated contaminants, such as benzene, chlorobenzene, and dichloromethane, and also petroleum-related contaminants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that are known as PAHs. And the most common elevated PAHs are benzoa-anthracene, naphthalene, and 1-methylnaphthalene. And these are troublesome contaminants. They're carcinogenic. So this slide shows some examples of figures that appear in the RI report that show where groundwater contamination has been found and the levels of contaminants. There are a number of the maps in this report. It's really instructive to just look at the pictures. These kind of figures show different levels of contamination going from clear or green or yellow in low areas to the purple or orange locations where it's higher contamination. So what's happened is we're talking about the groundwater. We know that the contaminants are found west of the site beneath the marsh. And as I said previously, EPA will determine what to do about that later on. But now let's talk about mercury in soil at the CBA. These figures show what was found in the remedial investigation. Mercury is present at the CBA at depth, mainly to the south and east of building number 1, as small discrete droplets or beads of mercury. These discrete droplets were observed as deep as 50 feet below the ground. And the beads of mercury are very small, ranging up to about 2 millimeters in size. Think of them as sand grains. Sometimes there are collections of a number of these at one location based on the soil type. And in some cases, they're beads or they're strings of these beads, they've been described as. And this was based on visual observation of soil cores that were recovered beneath the mercury cell building. So, to find the problem, know where and how much mercury is there. What are we going to do about it? So now, in the Superfund process at this site, we are at the stage of the feasibility study. So once you've defined the problem in the remedial investigation, you look at solutions to the problem in a feasibility study. In this case, we're focusing in on just the cell building area and just the mercury. So it's called a focused feasibility study. And this report was released in September of 2023. And again, just to summarize what we found, there's discrete droplets of mercury under the ground to the depths up to 50 feet that are continuing to cause groundwater contamination. So the FFS was done, and they in this they evaluated and reported on potential cleanup options. So the thinking is, now we know the problem, what can be done to reduce the risks? So the cleanup objectives were set, and potential cleanup methods were evaluated and screened. EPA ruled out some things that just weren't considered practical. One of the types of things would be removal. One common approach to contamination of the ground is just to dig it up, remove the contaminated soil. But this won't work at the cell building area because the old building slabs are there, and beneath them are an extensive haphazard network of steel reinforced concrete pilings. And to remove all of that material would be very labor intensive and expensive and difficult. Remember, think about this stuff way down deep. In situ stabilization is another method of contamination. And if you try to do in situ stabilization of the contaminated soil, you'd have trouble because that process requires mixing the soil and injecting cement-like materials to basically turn the underground into a block of, let's just say, cement-like material. And you do that with big equipment, but think of a mixer in your kitchen mixing up cake batter. So imagine trying to do that with steel reinforced concrete underneath the ground in all kinds of locations. Just asking for trouble, that would not be practical. People in the construction industry know that this wouldn't work in this situation. Another typical approach is to try to surround underground contamination with what's called cutoff walls or slurry walls. In this case, you could dig a trench around the CBA, the cell buildings area, and fill it with an impermeable material. But underneath, you would still have leakage because you don't have a clay layer under there to key in the wall that would encircle the contaminated soil. And so groundwater could leak out, contaminated groundwater could leak out, and also groundwater could seep upward and into the walled off area if hydrogeologic conditions change. And that could compromise the integrity of the wall, and basically the walls could blow out. So that was ruled out too. All right, so what did we end up with? We ended up with two most promising cleanup methods, best remedial alternatives that they could come up with. And they're similar activities. They're both in situ, and in situ biological treatment and in situ chemical sequestration were the two methods that were thought to be capable of reducing the available mercury adequately so we could prevent future groundwater contamination. They'd render the mercury insoluble so it would no longer degrade the groundwater. And improvements in the soil cover would be made over this cell building area also to reduce the potential for unacceptable mercury emissions into the air or intrusion from the surface down into the subsurface. Let's talk about in situ biological treatment first. That would involve injecting a bacterial agent to destroy the mercury. And this is considered innovative, and it would need extensive laboratory and field experimentation to determine if an effective biological agent could be found and how effective it would be in treating the mercury. There's not a lot of experience in applying a biological treatment for mercury in groundwater. And so that reduces the confidence that this approach would effectively destroy or isolate mercury at the cell building area. And again, that's the major goal of the cleanup. Now, the second approach would be in situ chemical sequestration. And that's an in-place treatment method also. And it would render the mercury insoluble, so it would no longer degrade the groundwater. That's our goal. The a sulfur-based material would be found and it would be injected into the ground to chemically bind with the mercury, forming an insoluble compounds and basically coat the individual grains of mercury with this insoluble coating. You could think of an M&M. The candy coating on the outside keeps the chocolate on the inside from melting in your hand. There would have to be pilot testing to determine the appropriate chemical amendment chemical the chemical makeup of something like that, a sulfur-based material that would work on this kind of mercury under these geologic conditions, and how much of it you would need to add to inject into the subsurface to effectively treat the mercury that's there. So there would have to be possibly laboratory tests, definitely field tests, and that's a typical thing for these type of in situ injection related remediation projects. So in the FFS, the information is presented from historical groundwater monitoring that demonstrates that to some degree, there's natural in situ mercury sequestration occurring now in the subsurface at the CBA. Natural sulfur containing materials are acting in this manner. And the mercury and sulfide concentrations and other geochemical evidence that was collected during the feasibility study and the remedial investigation shows that there's natural formation of mercury sulfide compounds in the subsurface at the CBA. So this is promising, and this increases the confidence that in situ chemical sequestration would be successful at the CBA. So what's next? What do we do now? We think in situ chemical sequestration or biological sequestration are the best potential approaches. What do we do now? Well, now EPA has been mulling over with the technical contractors from their agency as well as from the PRP's consultants, and they're going to announce soon a proposed plan. They'll come out sometime in June, we think, could be July, with their decision. They'll say, here's what we've done, here's what we think is the best solution to the problem, and here's some details about it. And that'll be the next official step toward cleaning up the CBA, a formal issue of the proposed plan. They'll also ask for public comment. This is all part of the Superfund process. And a public comment period will commence when this announcement comes out. And when it's issued, when the proposed plan is issued, EPA is going to schedule formal public meetings and hold a public comment period. Usually these comment periods are 30 days. In the past, EPA has been willing to extend it if there's significant public interest, and down in Brunswick, historically there has been. So we look forward to having a longer than 30-day comment period. And Rachel's got her finger on the pulse of the EPA, so she will probably provide a little more detail on best guesses for the release of the proposed plan and when the EPA would be coming to Brunswick to hold public meetings and availability sessions where you can come in at your leisure and ask questions and not just send it at a formal presentation. But they'll be coming soon. So after this comment period's over, anybody can weigh in and submit formal comments to EPA, tell them what they think about this proposed plan. EPA will decide what we're going to do. They'll consider all the comments. They put out a document that will include a responsiveness summary, which will detail all the public comments that are received and EPA's responses to those comments. And it'll be providing the rationale for the decision they make. The decision document will come out after all of these comments have been reviewed. And so that's the final step in this. EPA will release this record of decision for the selected remedial action at the CBA. And that's probably going to be we hope in early 2025. So that's our summary of what's been going on. A little bit about overall, but also more specifically focused on the cell building area, soil contamination with the mercury and other compounds, and the groundwater contamination. So that's it for me. I'm turning it over to Rachel. I appreciate y'all tuning in, and I hope you've understood what I said, and we're happy to answer questions. And if not just tonight even, you can always reach me through the GEC. I'm the community's technical advisor, so anybody in the community, I work for you. Let me hear from you if you need any explanations. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Frank. We do realize that 20 to 25-minute presentation about all this information is very abbreviated, but we're attempting to try to get as much information out to the public as possible, which is why we started these virtual webinars. So that does conclude the presentation portion of our program. And for anyone who was watching on Facebook or YouTube, this is our contact information. So if you have any questions or concerns or are just looking for clarification, we're also happy to help explain any of the images or share any of the resources, either from the EPA's page or our page. Just please contact us to let us know. And again, thank you all so much for joining. We really appreciate it.